Ah.
Good evening, good morning.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good day. So we were thinking that we wanted to do a 3-part series on the idea of alchemy and yoga and the process of alchemy. And we came upon this idea because we stumbled upon an old booklet of Richard's from many lifetimes ago. There it is. And it's what he, a booklet that he wrote for part of his thesis. And it's called The Alchemy and the Conjunction of Opposites. And it's something that we have talked about a lot and thought about a lot, and it started to hit us that this could be a nice topic for the whole, end of this year. Anyway, so that's how we came up with this idea. And as we started thinking about it, what comes to mind is that when you say alchemy, it's like some of the other sort of glittery and sparkly words that are out there that people go, alchemy, let me think about that. And it's like people, you say Tantra and people go, yeah, and they tune in, or you say Kama Sutra, same thing. And alchemy has kind of the same sort of vibe to it, where people have taken it and almost co-opted it, or almost made it into something. When I was looking it up online earlier, it was like all these face care products and stuff like that that were popping up as this is what alchemy is.
Face care products made of mercury and sulfur.
So kind of thinking about why alchemy and what is alchemy. And when I think that part of it becomes such a popular term in the modern age because there is this underlying sort of intuitive sense that something is not quite right. And that's what brings people to yoga often. That, sort of there's this feeling like, well, something's wrong. Let's look into magic, or let's look into alchemy. But then sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's where the inquisitiveness or the investigation ends, is just, oh good, well I've started to look into something a little more esoteric or a little off the beaten path, and thank goodness now I can get rid of that uncomfortable feeling that things aren't quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so alchemists historically have tried to remain in secret because usually their practices go against whatever the current Orthodox religion is. And so they're always bringing in the shadow side or the other side. And so they have always kind of been semi-illegal within many traditions. And so they've often associated with witchcraft, and witchcraft is often alchemical in nature. And so it's all hidden in code language, and just like reality. and so a little bit of history. The word alchemy, chem, chem is an ancient word for Egypt, meaning black earth. And alchemy is first mentioned historically in texts about 350 BC in Alexandria, where they brought together all of these different traditions from the Middle East and Europe and Egypt, and discovered, that there was this amazing secret doctrine that a lot of people were extremely eager to discover. And of course, the original goal for most people when they're doing alchemy is to create gold. And probably none of you would turn down a bar of gold if I gave it to you. Of course, you would donate it to charity or do something good to it. But and it's based on a number of different cultures coming together. So there was the ancient Mitra religion in Persia, along with the Zarathustris, the Zoroastrian religion. And they developed, the 7 different layers, the 7 different elements having to do with the 7 planets. And then there were the Kabbalists, and then there were this, who were the ones with the Yezobel? And the Kabbalists, the Hebrews, and then the Greeks were there, and it was all.
And then Egypt and.
Oh, of course, the Egyptians, and they had. Right, it was
their thing.
But they've been working for millennia on, basically the practicalities of metallurgy, and so they were into the actual building of it, and it was a common belief that one, because of the interrelatedness of chemicals and things, that if you were blessed by God, you could actually make gold. And of course, gold, as we know today, can be created, but its creation requires usually a very large star imploding in on itself, and the pressure is such that the elements are pressed together, and gold has that special quality of not reacting with other things. And so if I have a piece of gold and I cover it with something disgusting, it's still, although a lot of people would stand back until you cleaned it, but it doesn't react. It doesn't react chemically with anything. It's pretty cool.
And that, in and of itself, the idea that the formation of gold or the creation of gold is part of this, sort of common idea of alchemy, and the nature of gold that is non-reactive is fascinating when you think back to what we were saying about people being drawn to something like alchemy because they are feeling like there is something beyond, something more, something in their regular existence which is missing, and then they find this non-reactive substance. But then what also happens is gold, and immediately the mind attaches and to this idea of the value of gold and the glitteriness of gold. And so it's this interesting symbology, but also practical aspect of how the idea of creating gold is so central to this.
Mm-hmm.
So that what is actually the fusion that happens when you start creating things is something that is non-reactive, and yet sometimes one reacts to that non-reactive substance.
Yeah, and so all alchemists and ultimately believe that the world is divine, that gold is divine, that the world is divine. It is absolutely infinite, glory and light in and of itself. And this is considered in a hierarchical dualistic religion to be basically blasphemy. And so, therefore, the secrecy, and therefore, all of the different alchemical schools had to hide, and they would hide behind very strange symbols and things. But there's some common links among them. And our favorite one is on that page that we put up, and that's called the Ouroboros, and that's the snake that's eating its own tail. And this is kind of the mascot of the alchemical sports. Oh, it won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost as alchemy is almost as esoteric as moon technology. So. But the basis of the Ouroboros is it's a snake eating its own tail. And if you think about that or imagine that, which in yoga we love to do that, it's talking about the paradoxes of thinking. And so these schools love to look at what we would call in all language self-reference paradox. And for example, any kind of system of thought can't contain itself because it's based on its presuppositions. Okay, so and ultimately, if I explain the universe, so if I explain the universe as God and then His creation or something, or it's all impermanent, therefore it's bad, all of that is thought. And as we know from yoga, the main problem is this, what's called the samyoga, or the overlaying of nama and rupa. And rupa being form, in the alchemical sense, that would be the dark earth, that is Egypt. It would also be sensation, prana. It would also be reality. And then the names or the formulas we make for it, good or bad, because there are endless numbers of them unfolding, and some of them are pretty good, some of them are pretty bad. None of them can explain themselves. And therefore, when alchemy manifests, thought itself is stunned, as in yoga, and thought itself is then seen to be divine, but without any absolute to it. And so what the serpent eating its tail is it's when you realize that in order to know the limit of thinking, you'd have to think on both sides of the limit of thinking, which is, you can try this yourself. And what happens then is that you create, with this process of the snake eating its own tail, a container, or what is called a crucible or a pot. And this is the alchemical pot that you start then cooking in order to create gold, if you get good at it. And so what we do is we've all done this in our yoga practice. We've sat down and we've decided, I'm going to watch my thoughts. And then your thought comes up and says, that's what you think. And thinking doesn't even know what thought is, I think. But what thought is, it's a reduction of what is, in the alchemical sense, it's a reduction of even thought itself to a theory about thought. And so the snake eating its own tail is reflected in many mythologies around the world. So if you were actually extremely hungry, and in Asian mythology, there's this big thing of different gods or being very hungry, and so they start eating, and they just can't satisfy their hunger, and they start eating the very world that they're part of. And even after they've swallowed most of that, they have to then eat themselves. And so you run into this paradox of thought, just as the back of the serpent's head is being sucked into the mouth of the serpent. And there's a point where you just go, it doesn't work. And so the ability to watch thought without thinking, or even if you think you have to get rid of thought, to observe the thought that you think you have to get rid of thought, is the common in all of the alchemical schools. And so what this does is allows basic, what is called smriti, or sati in Pali, which is mindfulness, in which you could be sitting in meditation practice thinking, oh, and you've just memorized the meaning of the word nirvikalpa samadhi, or what's that other word?
I don't know.
Nirodha, okay, suspension. And you think, I know what that means. And you have a thought about it. In other words, you reduce the word nirodha to the theories about nirodha. And then you notice that, well, hey, my mind, if you're really with it, you've noticed that you're thinking about nirodha. And then you get, I think that this is bad. And then you very likely will go off on a story of thinking that you're a complete failure. And eventually, maybe years and lifetimes later, you start to see, oh, that was just the thought that I was thinking I don't know what I'm doing. And so the ability to actually observe thought as a divine phenomenon requires that you see that thought is essentially empty of any substance, but is divine. In other words, it cannot refer to its own presuppositions. And doing this then allows you to practice mindfulness. And this, in the schools of alchemy, is fantastic, because then you experience what we call hala hala, or the difficulty of alchemy. And this is why it was reserved. So alchemy was not for ordinary people. It was only for people who had this mystical desire to actually experience what was really going on, to really get the true gold.
But there was, in alchemy, even to this day, when it's practiced, there, as Richard said, there's a lot of symbology, and the symbol of the snake eating its tail really is a symbolic representation of that train of thought or non-thought that Richard was, explaining, which is this idea of the thought disappearing into this sort of process of thinking, non-thinking, thinking, non-thinking. And it is this representation of infinity. And many of the symbols had that as their base, was, that they were to symbolize infinity, which again is this aspect of yoga that when we really drop deeply in, there is this intuitive sense of the infinite that somehow pops up, and then it's gone because you think about it. And so...
Wait a minute, you just thought that.
Yeah, I just thought that. And so it's not gone, I'm just gone. Or maybe I'm not gone. It's that kind of spinning, nauseating sort of play of things. But that image within our own background of experience of eating one's own tail and forming this pot within which the real cooking and transformation can take place. And it's like this idea, the idea within meditation practice, that you have a container, and that you that by keeping the container sealed, there is this ability for the alchemy to happen. So it's an interesting,
it's quite an advanced
parallel.
practice.
Yeah.
And so when we are able to, and so we call this the fusion and confusion. Oh, so fusion.
Yeah, I'll do the confusion part. You can do the confusion.
Yeah, and so the hero of alchemy is a fellow named Mercurius, who has a wand called a caduceus. And what he does is he comes and he, as you're sitting in your initial attempt to practice alchemy, and you notice that you're thinking about your thoughts, and and in those thoughts you see all kinds of counter thoughts, and if you're getting good, you start to see forbidden thoughts, uh, demonic thoughts, unorthodox thoughts, thoughts that go against all of the theories you had about things or about yourself or about your ego. And when Mercury comes, and Mercury, remember, in modern, I have to remind people that Mercury is poisonous, okay? So old alchemists, they would drink it, and then, I probably already reminded them of that. But what would happen is that you would start to see opposites. So if I had a thought, and if I were very sensitive, having, been working on creating this alchemical pot, the opposite thought would also appear. And so if I had a thought about how wonderful I was at Zoom technology, then my intelligence, which isn't, I call it my intelligence, and then the intelligence would immediately in the background create like, ha, 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 you're terrible at that. And then it would create a counter thought. And so these thoughts and counter thoughts, or a thesis and antithesis, are often in the distracted mind kind of in conflict with each other. And so what Mercury does is Mercury comes along and he blesses the alchemical pot so that opposites and those things that are normally in conflict fall in love with each other. And then they start to interface and fuse with each other. And so this would be the conjunction of opposites. It's just like the classical example would be the king and the queen in a metaphysical system, or the male god and the female goddess, or in a classical system, or heaven and earth, because heaven and earth, in the way even most people interpret Sankhya, is often returned, or people interpret Buddhists this way, that they think that earth is just empty, the whole universe is empty, and being impermanent, get rid of it. But they don't see that thought of get rid of it, is part of it. And so with their practice, they start to say, oh, that thought is part of it. And so with the blessings of Mercury, then they start to see, oh, so these opposites like sun and moon, actually, if I can get them to unite or to like each other, then there's this kind of stunning ecstasy, which is the alchemical process. And so that's the first step, is to be stunned by the beauty of the earth, by the beauty of that which is often rejected, which would be one, impermanence is often rejected, death, decay, all of those things, old age, disease, amongst a lot of male-dominated religious systems, pregnancy, blood. Can you think of anything else? Mucus? All of that things that are, we don't want to deal with psychological fear. And just like when we practice yoga, when the yoga starts to work, or the alchemy, you've sealed the pot and you're actually being mindful in your yoga practice, you get hala hala, which is terrible. It's just like everything stinks. You start to face your own actual feelings about, well, you get to face the shadows of your own actual feelings, your own actual optimism, lust and greed. And so everything is joined together in the alchemical pot.
And an interesting thing when we sort of parallel this to the yoga practice, and again, coming back to this idea of a sealed container within which the alchemical process takes place, is that we have this urge to have deeper meaning, let's say, or to have a deeper experience. And we create this image of, the snake eating its tail, let's say, or we create the image of a pot or a cauldron within us that within which this transformation might take place. And so that's one thing to remember and to keep in mind. But another thing that equally needs to be remembered at the same time is that as yoga practitioners, the more we practice and the more we read, like in the Bhagavad Gita, which we've talked about a little, one of the underlying sort of global themes is this idea of interpenetration and interconnectedness, that everything is just completely intertwined and interconnected. And so as yogis, maybe we've read this, maybe we've actually even experienced this sense of interpenetration, interconnectedness with the world. So we hold that idea as well. And as we are creating this space within which to go more deeply into the teachings, and we've made our container, our sealed container, the problem that can arise is that within our thought process or even our visceral sense of things, we then separate that process and that image of the cauldron out from everything else. And in fact, everything else, even in the sort of most blatant symbolic vision of that, everything else is right at the border of it. So there is some interconnection right there. But what ends up happening in the mind and in the practices sometimes is that we forget the importance of the element of interpenetration in spite of the fact that we have sealed a cauldron. For instance, when you're doing meditation practice, yes, you've sealed this container, which is your meditation practice, but it isn't in actuality, even if you are in a 30-day retreat or a 3-year retreat, it isn't actually separate from the whole world. When the world explodes during your retreat, you too will explode, even though you've got a good boundary. And so within the parallel of the yoga practice and the process of alchemy, if we can set the container very carefully and very, mindfully, but without rigidity, that is where the real cooking starts to take place.
Right. Yeah, part of sealing the container is that the container has to go into the container. again, a language paradox. But the ego function uh, wants to hijack the process, which it does. And that's what makes alchemy. The fact that these are many different traditions, uh, and the majority of practitioners, being human, uh, tend to not be very good at it at first. And so it becomes an ego function. I have really sealed my container. But that whole idea that they've concealed, that's not in the container. That's part of their using the process. And so this is exactly what alchemy is undoing, which is why it was considered a special art only for the initiates.
Yeah.
But then again, it became very famous because it was intriguing, because everybody wants to have the secret. And so historically, um, it's a nice, what's the word, confluence of all of these different traditions bouncing into each other and, of course, borrowing from each other, because what they're working on is really exactly the same thing. And they realize that through the practice.
And so, keeping that in mind, if you are doing your practice or imagining this container that you've decided to create, and then the idea that Richard was talking about, where it's like the snake has got to continue to eat everything until it finally is eating its own head, right?
It also works. The snake
The
also works the other
way
way,
around.
where
Yeah.
it's coming out of itself.
And so that's the key, is to be able to look at it
Spin
almost like this sort of, pattern, like I don't know, some sort of psychedelic pattern that comes in and out of itself all the time, and yet doesn't lose its form, and yet doesn't exclude other things due to having a form. And so that is all we're asking when we step onto the front of our mat and decide, okay, I'm going to do a yoga practice. I want to just feel that sense of transformation and fluidity inside and outside. And I just want my own mind and ego and everything else that gets in the way to just chill for a little bit. And then the alchemy is the real study of how that transformation can take place.
Yeah, it's an exposure of the religious mind.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why it was considered a bad thing in most cultures eventually, because it was the work of witches. It was the work of these really bad people. So they had to keep it secret because they were really undoing the religious mind.
But then the great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle,
mm-hmm.
Came to sort of be interested in it as well. And so it's something that, can get distorted, as we were saying at the very beginning of the talk, mm-hmm. when the mind or the culture or the ego co-opts it. And it's something in a way that at this particular time in our current world, it's something, this idea of alchemy and the pure sense of alchemy, and the idea that the transformation and making things fuse together is of extraordinary importance.
Yeah, that the environment is important, that the earth is important, that other beings are totally important. So in the alchemical vision, you meet another being, and that being is actually essentially you. this is the, or that whatever the term they've used, like the divine or the real God, and that being is actually who the other being is. So it's quite an undoing of the religious mind, in that, as we know, the whole process is to make this almost as a religious container or a sacred space, but then you have to offer the sacred space to see that it is has no absolute to it itself. And that's, so sacrificing the sacrifice. If you have a holy mountain, throw the holy mountain into the fire of awareness. Even if you're in Egypt and you find the pyramids, which are pretty cool, you can toss them in the fire. Get in big trouble with the Egyptian government. I think that just happened in the last years.
Yeah, and so it's that's the fusion, and then the confusion is this where the mind or hesitation or fear or this embodied experience of emotion comes in and creates hesitancy.
Yeah, and makes you think that the thoughts you're having about it are it. Yeah. It's just like so fast. It's almost funny. And so
we wanted today to just lay a little bit of the groundwork about thinking about alchemy, thinking about comparing this process to the process that we do on our sitting cushions or on our yoga mats or as we chant. And then, to explore that a little more deeply over the next couple of weeks from a couple of different angles also. But this is sort of the foundation that, let it kind of settle in the back of your mind. We hope you come back to some of the other talks we do on it. But it's a really important, an important process in particular right now in this world. Because there is a huge amount of confusion on many, many levels, both due to the pandemic and due to this isolation that so many of us are experiencing, but also due to certain things like politics or the idea that sort of money and greed have filtered into all kinds of layers of experience in the world, not only in the United States. We try to claim it as only here, but it's all over the world. And looking at this idea of why people come to alchemy, what is it that draws people to that? And what is the actual process that's going on besides making gold, besides transforming elements into gold or silver?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, an alchemy.
Or anything. It doesn't have to be an alchemy today.
Yeah, I'm thinking that, well, Ganesh has a alchemical pot in his tummy.
Yeah.
And also he has a great appetite.
Yeah, we did that. That's good. We could do it.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll do
The Dhammapada.
Yeah.
So after we chant, if there are questions, we're happy to hang around and answer.
Okay. Om
Om
Gananaham Tva
Gananam Tva
Ganapatikam Mavamahe
Ganapatikam Havamahay
Kavim Kavinam
Kavim Kavinam
Upamashravastamam
Upamashravastamam
Jeshtarajam Brahmanam
Jeshtarajam Brahmanam
Ramanaspatana
Ramanaspatana
Shrinvamudivisidhasadanam
Shrinvanutivisiddhasaram. So thank you.
So your homework is to learn the entire history of alchemy.
And then
And all
produce
of the
some gold and hoard it.
language.
That's it. That's your homework. Learn
Yeah.
how to be greedy with. No.